Hey, this is the talk I gave at TypeLab, which is part of Typographics conference, which happens every June here in New York City. And I love TypeLab because, well, first of all, I love typographics because it gets together type designers and graphic designers and lots of interesting people to have like some really cool talks, and it's a very fun time. I love TypeLab because it's all of the like super type nerds that get together kind of around typographics, and it's a little more like free form, and people share sort of workflows they have or technical things they've learned or just like a deep dive look at the type they're making. And that's my favorite kind of thing to hear about and see and share at a type conference. So I did share this talk at TypeLab, and you can actually go see that recorded as part of the TypeLab video if it's still up. I don't know if they like take those down ever. So I'll link that in the description if I can. But I wanted to give a better quality look at, a better quality if you're sitting around watching YouTube at your desk. Look at the presentation I made and also kind of share some updates I've made to the workflow since then. It kind of motivated me to take a second look and clean it up a little bit and make it better since I presented this. So here goes. So my talk was called Supports and Sources, and in it I describe a workflow for how I control name sans very specifically within its very wide design space. So I'll get into what a design space is in just a second. If you're not familiar with name sans as a project yet, it is my kind of do everything sans serif project that's based on these beautiful name tablets of the New York City subway. So these are kind of wayfinding signs or signs of station names made out of tiles. And I just love the like geometry, but weirdness to these letters. They don't all look like you might expect. They've got some points that are sharper than average. Some of the things are kind of bottom heavy. So like the 3 and the S and the 8. It also combines, things you might see in like a typical geometric typeface with things you might find in more of a humanist grotesque typeface. So I'm trying to use all of these ideas that are kind of disparate and wide ranging and put them into a font that's really widely useful today and uses the latest technology and is really carefully crafted to work well in a variety of situations. So here's name sans as of now. This is a representation of what, as a type designer, I would call the design space. So kind of on the left side of the screen, you have the Roman styles, and on the right, you have the corresponding italic styles. The very first column, and then the fourth column, are the display styles, where the spacing is really tight and the geometry is really geometric, for lack of a better word. So these look beautiful and dramatic at large scale. And then the third column and the last column is the text optical size, which widens out the spacing and kind of opens up the interior shapes of letters so they retain legibility and readability. So they're easy to read in long text at smaller sizes or potentially far away. So you might use this for something like a wayfinding sign on a highway. And then in between the display and the text, there's what I call the standard style. And this is kind of like roughly spaced as kind of your traditional digital sans serif typeface might be. And if you had to use one font for everything, you could kind of use this one, though I would say the optical size range makes it a lot better. And if you did just use the standard style, you'd want to play with letter spacing, but I'm getting a little far into defining this typeface. Let me show a few close-ups. So what I like about this typeface is that it goes from really bold to really thin, and it goes still thinner, really thin. It was quite challenging to draw this in a way that would work, but these hairlines, I wanted them to be really hairline. So if you look at something like Helvetica Neue hairline, it's a lot thicker than this. And these weights actually are the other thing. Aside from letter spacing, these are the other thing that varies with the optical size range. So you can see the top row is the display optical size, and those letters are really tight fitting and really dramatic, and they have really smooth curves and things. And then the middle is the standard, and the bottom is the text style. So you can see the spacing is opened up and the weight range is less dramatic. So the ultra bold is more like an extra bold, and then the hairline is more like a more typical hairline. And yeah, things like the ascenders and descenders get a little taller too to give things more space. So you can test this out on your own if you want to at name.aerotype.com. You can buy it on Future Fonts if you want to use the typeface for your own projects. And it's a really fully featured typeface, which I've worked on for a long time, sort of like 3.5 years in a more concentrated sense. And yeah, you can try it out if you want. There's also font demos, like trial fonts, if you want to get those through Future Fonts. So yeah, again, here's what I call the design space. And now that I've marketed the typeface sort of, or explained what it is, I'll explain more of the technical side of this demo. So yeah, the design space, light to bold and display to text. To make this on kind of the back end, what I actually draw, as I call sources, are the corners. So the hairline display, the hairline text, the ultra display, and the ultra text, and then also the display bold and text bold. And then for the most part, the rest of these styles can be interpolated from between there. So when I say interpolation, I mean that you can generate, if the outlines are drawn in the right way, the middle point or the point that's 75% of the way from hairline to bold, etc. Each of these main sources has just over 1,000 glyphs. And some of those use components. So if you have like an E acute, you don't draw the E and the acute, you draw them separately and then combine them so that you can also make the A acute and the O acute and things. But they still have around, I think, 500 glyphs that do have manual drawing. And then when you get up to Roman and I think italic, you suddenly, don't just have those primary 6 sources, you have 12 primary sources. It's a lot to draw, but when you generate the whole font, you get way, way more than what you've drawn for it. So that's a huge plus of approaching type design in this way. Here, I've kind of got 72 styles that are named instances, but it's a variable font, so you can actually go in anywhere within this design space. Say you want to really dial in the sort of color of a page of text, you can do that very nicely with a variable font. Or say you're trying to use a logo that has like multiple text sizes, but maybe you want the lines, the strokes of text to look similarly thick. You can also do that really nicely here. So this is nice because it also has really smooth interpolation from bold to hairline, and not just really smooth, but linear. A lot of the time, if you have, say, a regular source between the bold and the hairline, you'd have some sort of an inflection in the middle where maybe it would be cruising at one speed and then it changed speeds. And if something has a pre-existing curve in the way it moves, it becomes really hard as an animator to kind of assert control over the curve you actually want it to have. Sometimes you want a countdown to be really linear, or sometimes you want it to be kind of swinging or, a curved progression. By having a wide interpolation range and then controlling just little things in between it, the animations can be smoother. This gives you a problem, though, in that you've got wide interpolation distances to cover, and your drawing can't really just scale from really thin to bold in a way that looks really great unless you do give it some interventions. So those interventions are called support drawings in between the bold and the hairline. And here's kind of a demo showing, like, with supports on the top line and without supports on the bottom line, the contrast in particular where letters join. So like the joint of the N, say the vertical stem into its shoulder, it gets way too thin and kind of, in my opinion, not classic looking, or maybe even a little ugly even, when you have no supports. And just to kind of, demo this in a way that I can control a little better, where is our font goggles? Let me put this on its own screen here. And let's say we've got like arrow type. And let's blow it up a little bit. Yeah, so like, especially the stuff matters at display scale where you might want the type to look, as perfect as it can. These look the same at 700 because there's a full source right there. But as soon as you start to go more towards like the regular weight, 400, you can start to see that the contrast in these letters is not really classic looking. It's not how I want it to look. And it kind of because it doesn't have an optically monolinear look, it just kind of like throws things into the typeface that don't really look like they fit in. And then the other big problem is that the things that I want to be square around, regular to light, are suddenly tall rectangles, which just look kind of silly to me. That's because at hairline, they are literally just very skinny, tall rectangles. They basically look like lines. And then at bold, they're kind of squares. So, in between there, of course, between a square and a line is a skinny rectangle. But I've added support sources so that these can stay more squares, all the way down to kind of 100, I think, or 200. And then they very quickly change into lines, which I think it looks great with that progression. Whereas here, I think it looks kind of silly, like for much of the useful range of the typeface. So these are the things I'm trying to control. So to kind of reiterate, there's some really kind of nuanced things like the crossbar of a lowercase e, but some things that stand out a little more like the joint of an N, or a lot more like the dots of letters and punctuation. So when I have support sources, the design space suddenly actually looks more like this. So we don't just have 6 sources, we actually have about 12 for the Roman and 12 for the italic. And this introduces quite a bit of complexity that we have to manage. So we still have our 12 main fully drawn sources, but then we have 7 additional sources for the uprights and 7 for the italics. And the main advantage here is that these sources have a lot fewer glyphs than, full-on sources, whereas my full bold and full hairline has a bit over 1,000 glyphs each. These only have as many glyphs as they need to support that specific drawing at that specific weight. So we have more control actually over the shaping between bold and hairline than we would with, say, a full source drawn at weight 400. And we don't have to draw all of the glyphs that interpolate just fine. Like, the letter H has no problem interpolating from bold to hairline because it's pretty much just strokes that don't have any contrast. But how can we keep it all in sync? That's a real challenge, because if we want to change, say, the width of the lowercase a in the bold, but we want to let it interpolate smoothly into the hairline, that means we have to suddenly update the support sources along the way, and we have to know how to update them. How does their spacing need to change? How does the actual outline of the A change, so that we can draw it with the improvements that we want? Well, there's the old way I was doing it, which was generating all of these instances through sort of a full font build and then copying and pasting glyphs and like manually copying and like typing out values for side bearings and margins. Total pain. I've moved on to a script which allows me to kind of generate that font in the script and then copy the shape to the background, update the spacing automatically, or point to me where I need to update the spacing, and it's very helpful. So that's the actual script I'm sharing here, and I'll kind of give a demo of how it works. The script is on GitHub through this QR code, or I'll share the link in the description on this video. Let me show you a demo as well. Yeah, here I've pulled up RoboFont, and you can see here's the full hairline source, quite a few glyphs, and the full bold source for, this is for the display optical size. And then we've got these 3 support sources along the way. So 100, 500, 200. So let's look at the A in 500, for instance. This foreground layer is the shape that I want it to be at 500, and it's pretty much monolinear. So because it's at 500, it allows things to scale up in a pretty monolinear way, all the way up past regular to 500. And then it gains a little bit of extra contrast for the midbar and to the joint. If we had no interventions along the way, this is the shape the letter would be. It's in the background layer. And you can see that it's got a little more contrast than I want it to. Like this is clearly a different thickness than this, which is not what I want. One other detail is that the foreground layer has kind of these red guidelines where the spacing kind of should be with the interpolation in mind. And then you can see kind of faintly the lines in the background where the glyph would be without interventions. So to give a better look at how this script actually handles it, here we've got our foreground of the display bold, and let's clear out the background glyph there to make it more clear. Let's say I want to make the glyph wider, and usually I wouldn't change it by much, but in this demo, I'll change it by a lot just to really show you how this might look. So yeah, it's a little bit ugly, but oh well, it's a demo. So I'll change the glyph width and the side bearing to match it. And if I save this, the 500 display support hasn't changed at all because we haven't made it change just yet. But if we go over to our code editor, here I've got open the script itself. And so basically I copy the path to this. It's important to read through this documentation if you're literally trying this yourself. There are some dependencies that you need to install. But basically I'll just say Python 3. I'll point to this script. So this runs the script, and then it needs a path to the full design space. So let me minimize things here a little bit and find that path. Here it is. I've got a few of them, but it's this one that I want. This has both the full sources and the sparse sources, Roman and italic. So I'm going to run it, and it computes for a second. And while that's running, let's go back to RoboFont. It'll take a second, and then it'll kind of prompt us that the sources have been updated in the file system, and would you like to update here? Here we go. So external changes were detected, update. And this will probably prompt us a few times because what we want is display 500 to update. But this is showing that it's literally updating all of the support sources. And yeah, here is the thing that we want. You can see that the foreground layer has remained the same. So the edits we've already made are safe, but the background layer has been updated to show what this glyph would be like without interventions, the spacing and the shaping itself. So if we wanted to kind of, update this medium weight to match it, we could do a few things. Maybe I'll copy this to the background, and then I'll copy the background to the foreground, and I'll kind of like match the spacing to the suggested spacing, and then I'll go back, and what I really care about is getting that contrast right. So I'll kind of dial that back in. And yeah, I mean, it's, I might adjust it slightly here and there. But it would be something approximately like that, And then this will generate a variable font with a really wide A, and we would have a medium that looks how we want it to look rather than how it will just look when it's going from these really wide distances. So I'm going to back out these changes. I use Git so I can, experiment and then decide to not do those things. So let's discard all of the changes to our sources. And if we go back to RoboFont, for instance, it'll say, oh, there were updates again. Let's update them back to where they were, kind of reverting the change. Okay, we're back to what we want it to be. The display is back to what we actually want it to be. So that's kind of a quick demo of how that works. And you can imagine it's a lot more painful if you don't do those steps. It might seem really small and trivial, but it's actually been super helpful to me in keeping the system kind of coherent. It's just one example of how you can use scripts to make a variable font build or a large font project work in a way that you need it to work to make the project possible. Without that, it would be too much of a pain to use support sources to the extent that I wouldn't do it. So with that in mind, I can't make all of this happen on my own. My script is actually using libraries that are written by people who are much, much better engineers than I am. So I'm using font tools and font parts and UFO processor and UFO normalizer, a lot of things that are built by people like Eric von Blackland and Tao Lemming and Ben Keel and Yus von Rossum and so many others. And thanks especially to Bedad, the variable font I'm building is quite reliant on the varlib part of font tools to generate everything and make the math work. And so that is a level of genius that I do not have on my own. And I'm really glad that there are people out there who are making the tools that allow type designers like myself to produce things we couldn't have 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So yeah, it's a fun time to be in this field because things are getting better and better in ways that at least I really enjoy. So if you have any questions about fonts, font development, let me know in the comments here, or you can find me over on Instagram or Mastodon or via email. And I'm almost always happy to talk about type. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Take care.